7.5 as possible.
Right.
Okay, today is the first meeting of Team Snow Leopard. It's May 23rd, 2018. And for today's discussion, we'll dive into differentiated instruction. So for the purposes of this discussion, we'll use the defined term as adapting content, process, or product according to a specific student's readiness, interest, and learning profile. And just as a kickoff, what does that mean to everybody?
I think probably just thinking about at least an awareness that people may learn at different speeds by different means. And just first of all, I think there has to be that awareness of that fact and thinking about how to present that material to different people and with different life experiences and backgrounds and so forth. So,
sure.
Yeah, I would agree with you, Julie. I think I mentioned last time that Carol Ann Tomlinson said her favorite phrase was respectful teaching. She considers differentiated instruction as being respectful to your students and catering to their needs and their interests, their backgrounds. And I love how, Cedric, you've got, it's their readiness, their interest, and their learning profile as well. Like looking at those student-centered kind of qualities when you're thinking about differentiation.
Sure.
Yeah. When I was looking at the definitions of differentiation, just going through a few, Jenny mentioned Tomlinson. I was looking at Sparks as well. She calls it the process of identifying students' individual learning strengths, needs, and interests and adapting lessons to match them. What's interesting though is the word profile kind of stands out to me. I wonder, it almost makes you think of a social media profile where you have your categories of interests and it's a way you interact with people. It represents you in a way. Hadn't really thought about that in terms of differentiation. It might, if you're a teacher, you might have a profile for each. Well, you do in a sense. I mean, you always have a grade book, but a more extensive profile of here's who. I'm almost envisioning kind of a matrix.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that teachers would definitely spend that time to create those types of profiles. But I think in a sense, doesn't that create a additional workload for the teacher? Because I know it would probably take some time to compile those profiles, especially when you're depending on the specific area that you're teaching in, that it would change. If you're doing K through 12, you're getting a different class every year. So at what point are you carving out the time to profile the new set of students coming in?
Yeah, and to me, it almost seems like that once you have a profile, it's just sort of like that student is pigeonholed into being this certain way. And then there's that, generalization that this is how this student is, instead of realizing that people change from day to day, month to month,
Right. And I didn't see anything in the research that would indicate that there's some type of tracking to see where that transition occurs during a course.
Right.
I didn't see that.
I can see two sides of the coin when it comes to profiling. Like, I like how you brought up that point, Robert, about, student profiles and looking at it from a multifaceted point of view. But then I completely agree with you, Julie, when you say, not pigeonholing students and putting them into some kind of learning style. Like, I don't think learning style is the same as profiling. I know
that learning style triggers you, doesn't it?
Yeah. You tell. So I'm so glad that you brought up profile, because shouldn't we understand the different, multifaceted aspects of our students in terms of their profile? And then, Cedric, when you said, isn't this a lot of work? I actually posted my first essay. I actually condensed it and made it more kind of less academic. And I posted that on my blog. And then on my blog, I kind of advertised it in different social media areas. And you should have heard a couple of math teachers from wherever they were in the world saying how much time this is going to take. I hate this word differentiation. And, you know, it's just this everyone's jumped on this bandwagon, and it just, you can't do it. Realistically, you can't do it because it just takes too much time. That's the response that I got.
I believe it. And I can totally see that, because if you differentiate it into, let's just say, 4 different learning styles, that's 4 different types of course designs, I'll say, that you'll have to create for each one of those groups.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And I think that's why when you asked, you know, first what we, how we look at that definition, that's why to me, awareness and just thinking about it comes to mind, because it's just, even if you're, I forget who it was, it might've been Tomlinson, who said, even if you just do a little bit, you know, it's not like you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this. It's just to be aware and be thinking about, okay, you know, maybe some people think or learn differently, whatever it is. And, and then I just have to say, every time I hear interest, I think motivation, you know, from 8-11. So, you know, if a student is interested in, you know, I think that those go hand in hand. You know, one way we're able to motivate our students is to find where their interests are and maybe kind of work with that area. And so that might be one way that we can differentiate. But yeah, interesting to think about profiling.
Yeah, and it's funny that you said that, because when you just highlighted interest, my thought was completely different. I was thinking more of content specific interest versus an interest like a motivation, as in, you know, something that could apply to each one of the courses. I was thinking specific. So if some student has an interest in robotics, so you profile all those kids and put those into one learning style, and you design some content around that. It's kind of where my thought was.
But that goes hand in hand with motivation, because then if they're interested, it's not separate, then they're going to be more motivated to learn, because it's, you know, a video game or whatever.
Yeah, something that they like. Yeah, you're right. Okay, well, that's a good kickoff and segue into the list of questions that I've kind of captured. So from a technology perspective, what technologies can support teachers implementing DI?
Yeah, you know, when I read these sources, for instance, one of the Teach Thought articles, it seems to me like the most direct technology that could help differentiation would be adaptive learning tools. But that also raises a concern that those adaptive learning tools, they're almost always third-party tools, because in order to develop them, in order to have, you know, some kind of algorithm to respond, your average person can't develop that. Or, you know, if it's time consuming to develop 4 different lessons, try developing an adaptive learning platform. So, you know, that's where we have to, you know, it's almost like you have to turn that aspect over to Pearson or McGraw-Hill or something like that. So I see that as the most direct one. You know, kind of a lot of possibilities there, but also kind of boxed in by third-party platforms. Sure,
that makes complete sense. And in addition to that, I think it would go a step further if it was not one of the actual core classes. If it was something, you know, some elective, that would probably need even more customization at some point.
Yeah, and it might not exist if the course is too, you know, the platform might not be there.
Right, hence the customization. So it would be from scratch.
Yeah.
It's quite expensive, right? Adaptive technologies, because they're third party. Yeah, so practically speaking, then, you know, what technologies can we use? That's one option. what could we do that would be more kind of reasonably cost effective and would include more or allow teachers to be more inclusive in their teaching. Sorry to throw that question out.
Yeah, if you look at it and you say, okay, how could I accomplish this with certain tools that I have? You know, the first thing that comes to my mind is some kind of almost social media platform where you can, or maybe learning management system where you can track progress and, you know, have these flexible groups. You know, some learning management systems are better at that than others, though.
I think that is key, though, is having so that the instructor, the teacher would have control over the content or the whatever, because to me, it seems like if there's a third party thing, again, we're getting into the you know, profiling. These are these students. And so really it takes the control away from the instructor, the teacher, to be able to adapt it to that. So it kind of throws the whole differentiated instruction out the window in a sense.
You know,
good point.
I don't want to take it too far off topic, but one of the sources I started reading for this had it wasn't even about this, but it had a really provocative kind of section where it talked about K-12 online instruction. And it basically just flat out said that K-12 online instructors don't actually teach anything. They just use these platforms, and most of the lessons are just kind of prepackaged. And I thought, wow, that's you know, it was kind of a very surprising, hardcore sort of statement right in the middle of that. And I said,
that's exactly where people get the idea that, well, we don't need teachers because technology can just replace it, you know. And
see, I can't. To me, what you're describing, Robert, is individualized instruction from the 50s. You know, where content is delivered like it's a set content. It's not differentiated. It doesn't allow for student interest, background, or process. So the only differentiation might be pace because you're working individually. But to me, that's individualized instruction, which is very different to differentiated learning and personalized learning. I was going to say, having taught at secondary schools, that's my background as a secondary teacher. And even though I've been in brick and mortar and that's my entire career, I would say that most brick and mortar K-12 schools now are actually blended environments. If they're one-to-one schools, everyone has an LMS. Everyone uses Moodle or Blackboard or something. There's always blogs going on outside the classroom. There's always discussions outside the class. There's always all this engagement that happens. So I think the beauty probably of the technology helping us with differentiated learning is the blended environment where an online can, but the blended environment where the brick and mortar incorporating all of these technological tools and digital tools to support learning outside the classroom with the flexibility of time, pace, and maybe interest. You know, if you could offer a few courses and students just choose which ones they kind of do, as well as attending face-to-face. So that's how I see some of the advantages of using technology to enhance differentiation and personalized learning.
And what you said about choice, I think that's another key word, you know, when it comes to differentiated instruction. It might be just giving students a choice, you know, of doing 2 different assignments, or we've seen that in the literature, examples of that. Which really doesn't require that much more work on the teacher's part.
Exactly. I think there is one route that I think would be very laborsome and tedious, and that is if you do plan 4 different, you know, lessons for every single lesson. But if you, as Julie said, introduce that element of choice, like what Dr. Ray's doing with us with the research articles, we're actually choosing our own research articles. So I'm choosing everything about mathematics education, you know, and Julie, you're probably, you know, researching your interest area, but it's still to do with differentiation and on. So, you know, we can give students that same choice. Actually, they can learn the mathematics, but it's any kind of way that they want to learn it. I could offer that choice, and then it wouldn't be so laborsome for me as well to plan. Yeah.
And that goes back to the interest.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. Do we have anything else we want to add to question 1? Jen, you already kind of cracked open question 2, talking about the potential benefits of using technology. Did anyone have anything else to add in terms of potential benefits?
Yeah, I had a few. One of the sources I looked at, and this was Martindale and Crawley, they brought up something that I hadn't really considered, which is, you know, in terms of benefits or advantages, you know, one of the advantages is that if you have online courses where the communication, and this is specifically online, where all of the communication is through some kind of digital platform, that communication is almost always going to be archived and able to be examined later. That record can then become something that informs your differentiation. You know, it can be something that you look back at and say, okay, well, what did they say at this point? That indicates that I might need to adapt this to their own style. That's something I had never even thought about before.
It's kind of the one thing I thought of, and it goes exactly along with kind of what you're saying, Robert, was assessment. And that's one way you could go back and look at that. And probably that's one of the benefits I thought of to using technology is the assessment aspect.
Yeah, I think that was the biggest one. And I think with a lot of these learning strategies, where you're using technology or not, that's one of the keys to kind of validate what was learned. And I think that's a tricky aspect of it as well, because you can implement all these shiny new objects and technologies, but if you can't validate that they've actually learned and have a way to kind of document that, it's going to kind of all be questionable going forward. But yeah, that's a good point, Robert. Okay, I think we've kind of touched on question 2. Let's move on to question 3, which is, what potential outcomes would you expect for students being taught up? And well, this is actually a 2-part question. And how can technology assist with that?
I first want to know what we mean by taught up.
Teaching up?
I mean, I know we talk about it all the time.
I had to change that. I didn't like how it sounded either.
I just want to, I mean, I'd like to talk about how we all really think about what that means. You know, like, what are we talking about? That we have high standards, that we, you know?
Well, I think you're heading in the right direction. In my perspective would be, as the teacher, you would have a basic baseline for a certain knowledge when kids come into your class. So once you go through your instruction, I'm assuming you give some type of pre-assessment, and you'll see that, hey, Johnny's not performing as everyone else is in the class. So even when I try to implement this DI strategy, I'm going to do it at the level that everyone else is on, and see how he kind of assimilates to that. That's kind of my view of being taught up.
I was thinking, I suppose what I think this is from the work of Tomlinson. She, you know, one of her tenets is that you shouldn't be teaching and aiming instruction to the student in the class that has probably the weakest background, let's say, you know, because what are the rest of the students going to do?
Right.
So I suppose I'm trying to interpret as well, and kind of asking the same questions as Julie, that, you know, you have this high ceiling, right? And that's what teaching up is. Like you've got this high ceiling, but you've got to be able to have like a low threshold for everybody to be able to enter that classroom. And yes, people, you know, the majority of people can reach that ceiling, but they should be allowed to actually exit at any point within that. Within that band. Do you know what I mean? That's my personal opinion. I think she says everyone should reach this goal, but, you know, for me, I don't necessarily believe that everyone can reach the highest level goal, but everyone can reach their potential and improve in wherever they are. Everyone can make progress wherever they are, but it's not necessarily the same outcome and the same progress. Does that make sense, what I'm saying?
Yeah, and so, sorry, Robert, go ahead.
So just quick clarification. When you say they can exit at any point, does exit just finishing the class?
The exit means like whatever the learning goals are. Let's say we're teaching up and the learning goal that's really complex is here. I'm saying that students may not be exiting, like coming out of that learning with that same goal. But they have to be given the opportunity to make progress wherever they are. So there's a band of progress, let's say, and this I don't want to say top, but that's the highest. That's the highest band. Not everyone's going to reach the highest band, right?
Well, I think when you use the bands, I think I don't necessarily know that the band is always that high. The band may be lower to basically encompass more students.
I think it's Tomlinson that said that it has to be challenging regardless. I mean, and I think that that's probably the goal. If it's easy, that might be where we can see where maybe we need to raise
absolutely
standards a little bit. If everybody's providing, it should be challenging, but with support. Isn't that what she says? It's
that, what's that called? That proximal, the zone of proximal
development.
Yeah, it's hitting that, isn't it? That's what, so for me teaching up, we just have to, I think I like how Julie started off, we have to define what that means.
Right.
You know, does it mean that everyone's going to reach the same goals, or is it just really focusing on that zone and helping students, and everyone's going to be in a different place within that zone, right?
Right.
So
but I think if you that middle bar between the student that needs some extra help and that high quality, I think that should be the baseline. And then, you know, as assessments take place and those results come in, I think I would hope that DI would allow you to adjust up, like you mentioned. So I think that works. And like I mentioned, how can technology assist with that? Does that go back to what Robert mentioned about the archive documentation to kind of give you that guidance to tweak the proximity?
Maybe, you know, I think a lot of it, I think probably one of the most useful tools for this kind of discussion would be digital assessments, you know, and simply because they provide you with analytics that you might not calculate on your own. I mean, let's be honest, if you're grading a pen and paper test, I mean, do you bother to, I mean, you might look at the average, but do you bother to create a diagram of, you know, that kind of thing? If you have digital test results, it tells you a lot more, a lot quicker than you might be able to be motivated to do on your own.
Right. So if you got a group of students who struggle with question number 10 because it was kind of tough. Yeah. I get it. Makes kind of good sense. Okay. Anything on potential outcomes before we move on? All righty. Question number 4, are there any disadvantages to combining DI with technology in the classroom?
I'm going to bring up the assessment point as a disadvantage. It could be, if overused, it could be a disadvantage that we only rely on the numerical data collected from students to judge where they are, rather than using, you know, formative data to adjust teaching and learning. So if we overuse the standardized assessments, it's another one of my bugbears.
Yeah, because you don't want to devalue the teacher's own observations, if you will, because she or he could capture something that the analytics wouldn't.
Yeah. Well, I think this goes back to the profiling. You know, if we say, okay, they're in this particular technology, they're in level 4 and they have to stay there or whatever it is. I mean, I can't help but this isn't really related to technology, but like accelerated reading. You can only read books within, you know, 4.5 to 4.7 instead of letting students choose. And again, it kind of goes back to the choice, you know, where their interests are. And
that sounds terrible. Accelerated reading.
Yeah,
I've never heard of that.
There has to be some flexibility in there.
I think it's destroyed, the whole accelerated reading has destroyed kids' love of reading.
Yeah.
Because now it's like they just have to get their points. They're reading to get their points.
Yeah, that's exactly what you know, it's one of these things that if you push it to its logical extreme, you end up with some kind of dystopian novel. I mean, it's like they're slotted in these tracks, and no, you're a 4.2. You can't associate with the 4.3s. Are you crazy? You know, it's
Don't even get me started on tracking.
Yeah, you would hate it, Minnie. You would absolutely hate it.
I think everyone knows my views, right, on tracking and learning styles, you know, and I think with differentiation, it's not about tracking as well. That's not one of the, you know, recommendations for being inclusive, for providing an inclusive classroom to track. And I remember I watched Carol Dweck came to Hong Kong last year. You know, she's the growth mindset person from Stanford. And she said that when she was in primary school, she was sat in percentage order of what she got in her IQ. It was ridiculous. Wow. Yeah, a percentage score of IQ. It was so demeaning. And, you know, she was just put into this category, and this is where you are, and this is where you sit. And I just thought, how horrendous. So that's why she's dedicated her entire life and work to growth mindset.
Well, and I think that's exactly why, you know, all these ideas get put out there, but then when they get actually into use, it becomes something entirely not what it was meant to be, you know? And so, I don't know. It's crazy.
Because they have to be.
I forgot what I was going to say, but
crazy fits.
Yeah, like the accelerated reader. Not to get too far off the topic, but you know, whoever came up with it, you know, they're thinking, oh, this is a way to get kids to read, and it'll be fun. But by the time it gets implemented on the ground level, it looks like a procedure. You know, and it looks like it looks very.
Yeah. And people stop thinking about looking at it and thinking, okay, is this working? Is it, you know, what's
it's all about points.
Yeah, they forget to think about it and examine how it looks when it's actually in practice.
Right. And like Robert said, not to get off track, but it's what's the assessment on the back end of that whole program? Is there one?
Yeah, they read and then they take a test. And they have to get so many points every 6 weeks.
Oh, it just sounds horrendous.
and in my kids' school, they can't go on the field trip unless they get a certain number of points. So.
This is ridiculous.
See, that's even different from what I've experienced in the past, because from what I experienced, there were points associated with particular books. So there wasn't really an assessment. You get points based on the level of book you read, and that's how you cumulative reach whatever bar it is for the program.
Well, it's kind of like that. So like one book is worth 10 points, and you take a test, and if you get only 80%, then you get just 8 points, let's say. But you have to get a certain amount. But my daughter just got in trouble for taking tests for her friends because she felt so bad for them because they weren't going to get to go to the party.
This is ridiculous that our students are being punished for not being able to choose what they want to read. To me, this is as bad as performance. What do you have in the US? Performance pay
for performance.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. It's as bad as that. It's as bad as that. Sorry.
Yeah, a lot of that depends on the state too. It's different in every state.
Right.
Now, that to me is the craziest thing. Why wouldn't there be standardization across all the states?
Yeah, I don't know. Cedric, are you a K-12?
I am not.
Oh,
but I've raised 3 boys through the system, and I've substituted, and I've dabbled in there, so I'm a little familiar with how that system works. At least in Georgia, I'm not sure about the other states.
Right.
Yep.
So to bring it back to sort of like differentiated instruction, but we can make this work. We can make it fit because it really does kind of fit. You know, like saying well, the question about flexible grouping, you know, when I saw that question, it's kind of like, okay, here's the level 4 readers, here's the level 5 readers, we're going to put them in these groups, and then here's the level 2 readers, and which sounds kind of good because maybe they will all, you know, help each other or whatever. But then we can't forget like the social emotional aspect of learning, and they think, oh, well, you're in the 2 group and I'm in the 5 group, and you know, so the grouping,
it's tracking.
Yeah, it sounds a whole lot like that experiment they did in the 60s with the brown eyes and the blue eyes kids in the classroom where they separated them.
Oh, I didn't know about that.
I vaguely read that. Cedric,
I saw a video, and basically what they did was they separated the kids with the blue eyes and the kids with the brown eyes, and the ones with the blue eyes got different treatment. And then you could see over time, the teacher treated the kids with the blue eyes differently and the kids with the brown eyes differently. And then when they went through these series of exercises, you know, they did some assessment at the end, and it basically just destroyed the kids with the brown eyes, their motivation, their interest, everything. And it was, I don't even know how they got permission to do this because it looked like an active classroom to me. But it was pretty interesting. But it was all about the culture in the classroom and how teachers could kind of impact that just based on something simple as eye color.
Wow.
Yeah. So when we're talking about, you know, learning profiles and flexible grouping and all those things, that kind of popped into my head. I'm like, yikes.
Yeah. And you know what? Let me put this in there because you know, when we talked about the profiles and the way Julie and maybe Jenny mentioned them, I was kind of thinking I maybe had an opposite idea of the way a profile would work, which is it's not like the teacher pushing the profile to the student. It's more like pulling the information and kind of adapting the profile based on what the student does. So not necessarily, you know, okay, I'm going to put you in this corner. More like, and it's more of a private thing. It's not on a bulletin board. It's more like, okay, he shows a lot of facility with this, or he performed differently than I thought here, so I have to adjust what I know about him. That's how I maybe that's
I like that
scenario.
And that makes sense
observations
too. Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. In that way, you probably get a little different course dynamic as well, because if you're moving them around as they change, you know, they're getting different interactions with different students and potentially learning, you know, even from kids that are on a different learning profile.
Sure.
So that makes sense.
I like that. I like that aspect. It's just knowing your students, isn't it? And observing them, and then it's formative assessing them so that you can plan and teach according to what their kind of needs are. Yeah.
And how they progress.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. Now that we've completely gone off the deep end, let's try to come back to where were we?
Probably like 6, I think.
Okay, well, let's shoot for 6. So how can teachers prepare students to engage with new technologies in a DI setting? And I think we were kind of headed that way with the discussion we just stopped.
Sure.
How can teachers prepare students to engage?
See, this is one of my issues when we're talking about it. If we're going from classroom to classroom, I mean, is there even standardization around how teachers can use it? Because you can be in one course and kind of like we talked about earlier, if the teacher defines DI one way and another teacher is using a different definition, the interpretation is different, the application is different. So I don't even know that there's standardization around it.
I think the definition is so broad, though, isn't it, Cedric? So if we think about its ways to be able to teach and plan learning engagements to make sure that the students are all included and making progress in their learning, then there are multiple, I think, variety of different strategies that a teacher could interpret, which is quite nice, because then a teacher can interpret what that means as long as they're catering to the needs of their students and every student is experiencing progress in their learning.
Yeah.
We, in terms of technology, a lot of schools, the last school I was at, they use GAF, so all the Google apps for education, and the whole, they had 22 schools on it. And just having the same technological platform and something so powerful as Google just allowed everybody to collaborate on a completely different level. It enabled, I think, students to be able to, you know, work on projects. So if we're talking about content, process, product, and effect, they could work on projects that had a different product. You know, some would make videos, some would, you know, do a Google Slides presentation, or so that would be product. But the platform itself was so powerful, I think, that it empowered students and teachers to be able to differentiate their learning in the classroom, if that's an example.
There was in the syllabus, there's a video, I can't remember, I don't know if you guys watched it, but I can't remember where it was or when I watched it, but I wrote down that in the video, they defined DI as sequence of common sense decisions made by teachers with a student first orientation. And so, and there was the outlining of the four kind of aspects. And then she added one more, I think it was Tomlinson.
Yeah.
Added one more.
I think I put the video on the Padlet wall.
So the first one was like engaging learning environment, work hard, work hard, shoot high, I think she said, and high quality curriculum with clearly defined goals, ongoing assessment, response to students' instructional needs, and then she added the effective classroom management. So in other words, like if you're going to do some kind of grouping, everybody starts at the same time, ends at the same time, if they're doing different things, kind of, you know. So I thought that was, because that's kind of broad, like what you were saying, Jenny, where it's not, you know, everybody can kind of interpret that as, okay, if my goal is student first, you know, kind of thing, and I'm just aware and thinking about how to do it, it's going to change in every class. And I think that gets back to why in practice these ideas don't work, because we take that autonomy away from each individual teacher to be able to see it. And see how to put it into practice, excuse me, in that individual teacher's environment with those individual kids, kind of thing.
I think that's why Tomlinson says that they're not strategies. So what you just said, Julie, supports the fact that it's not a list of strategies that you follow. Yeah.
It's more theory.
It's not like you have to do this, this, and this, and this. It's
You know, one thing that strikes me is, you know, one of the things we're going to be reading about is, you know, backwards design or understanding by design. You know, a lot of it, you know, when we get so discouraged and we look at it and think, oh, this is going to take too much work, you know, I'm just going to rage quit this whole process before I even get started. But what you have to understand is it's very hard to retrofit something like differentiated instruction. It's very hard to say, okay, I'm going to take exactly what I have and differentiate it 5 different ways. But it's much easier to design it from the start that way. You know, it's not going to be a ton of extra work if you design it from the beginning. Now, of course, it will require a redesign of what you already have, but it's you know, it's not as bad as it is to retrofit what you already have, in my opinion.
I completely agree, Robert, because it's not, I think that's one of the, descriptions of a blended environment. A true blended environment is not when you take a face-to-face course and you just tweak it and put it online. You've got to completely change pedagogy and instruction. And so you've got to have that mindset of, you know, designing and incorporating for differentiated learning when you plan your units, not having something existing. And of course, it's going to be a lot of work. Then if you've got something existing and then you're trying to do all these other things, that's not going to work.
Yeah, you know, I try to compare it to, you know, picture, you know, what happens when you get a new textbook. You have to redesign everything. Picture it like that. You just got a new textbook. And you just got to, you know, design it from the ground up. It happens to every teacher. You know, when I do encounter teachers that are very resistant to this kind of thing, you know, there are certain things that make you redesign everything in education. I mean, there just are.
Yep.
New textbook, a new principle, a new, you know, law that's passed. I mean, it does happen. So.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, I agree. It's like building a house and then deciding that you want a basement.
Exactly.
Kind of hard to kind of undo that. And, yeah, that's what came to my mind.
I like that. I'm going to use that. I'm going to use that. Do I have your permission?
You have my permission. Go right ahead. Oh, man. Okay, let's move on to the final question of this discussion. And I think we've kind of identified the response for this one. How can we evaluate the success of implementing DI using technology? And I think we've hit the point that assessment can definitely benefit us from a technology perspective, since we're, like Robert mentioned, it's that archiving that's giving us the ability to go back and assess what we found and kind of tweak as necessary to get our courses.
Multimodal kind of aspect as well, where you have so many, you know, different multimedia that you can that you're exposing to students, rather than just that brick and mortar or the print, you know, in a textbook. Yeah. So I think that the multi.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, I think if schools or school districts decide to use the suite of Google applications, it's much easier for students to transition from grade to grade because of exposure. And I think the further along you go, you expose to different aspects of that same technology. A lot easier to progress that way, I think.
Yeah.
Familiarity is important.
Yeah, and it helps. And not only that, when you get out into the real world, those are things that are going to be useful to you, especially when you get in the workplace.
Well, I know that, and I don't know about you, Robert, because but for online teaching in my institution, they want us to have like the setup the same in every class. You know, it says start here or course introduction or whatever it is, so that students are, that familiarity is, they're not going from one class to the next and having it. Well, I mean, I think we kind of see it in our experience in the DET program, you know, trying to get used to the setup. Sometimes it's like, okay, it would be convenient if everybody's was the same and we're not, you know, looking all over the place. But
yeah, because I remember the discussion about where to post the assignments.
Yeah, you know,
that was pretty funny.
Julie and I talk a lot in the first weeks of the class about, okay, I just got to learn where everything is in that class. You know, I've got to look 4 different places in this one class, whereas in this other class, it's all in the same page.
Yeah.
So do you know who's really good for that? Sarah.
Looking at
really good. She's really good for that.
Yeah, she spends a lot of time up front getting to know where everything is. So,
well, and it can be really overwhelming, you know, for students. And I think that it's made me be more aware of my students, you know, at the beginning of the class. So now I like post a video that's just kind of navigational stuff, you know. Here's how you navigate this class, and it's made me more sensitive to that, because you can feel like, okay, it's either, you know, I'm going to jump into this or I'm going to jump out the window kind of thing, right? At the beginning, it's
close. It's very close. That's,
you know.
But that's a good strategy though, because it sounds like in a sense that's also teaching up. You're using a technology to educate, you know, your students on that particular aspect of your class. Yeah. Whereas, you know, if it wasn't there, you know, they still be floundering and sending you random emails and stuff.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to that, you know, thinking and awareness, because if you can anticipate those kind of things with your students, anticipate where there might be, you know, the struggle, or, you know, that would be providing the support at the time when it's needed, kind of thing. But
sure, that helps with the retention.
And that's differentiated learning.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because we can frame it that way. Get off talking about anything.
Well, I mean, it's broad enough. I mean,
Yeah.
Absolutely it is. Well, that's all the questions I have for today. Are there any other general discussion topics we want to get into? Because I know we're close to that 7 hours.
Has it been 7 already, man?
It's almost 7.
That went so quickly.
Well, you know.
Well, Jenny probably needs to get to bed, I bet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially since you're leaving for, I don't know, Cedric, if you saw the fact that she's leaving for the UK tomorrow. So
I did see that. Yeah. So it's either get some rest now or enjoy that long plane ride.
Yeah.
Right.
Have you stopped recording yet? Have you stopped
Not
recording?
yet.
Yeah, I think we're getting to that point. We probably need to go ahead and stop.